on Facebook.
Time is, we got 6 minutes.
So we're at www.upenn.edu/AARC.
Our Facebook page.
Oh, Facebook. Thank you.
So Darren, you're going to follow the Facebook page, or Colleen? Who's following
Yeah.
that?
I can follow the Facebook page. That's fine. We need someone to follow the Zoom chat. That's probably going to be
Colleen, you're going to follow the Zoom chat. Darren, you follow the Facebook chat.
Yes.
Yep.
Hello, anybody that is watching from Facebook. We will be starting in about 5 minutes. If you are in the room for the webinar, we will be starting shortly.
We have Arminta, she's here. Hello, Arminta. Thank you for joining us. Oh, make sure my mic is right.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Arminta raised her hand. If you have a question, Arminta, you can write it in the chat. Howdy, she says. Howdy. Colleen, you have to change it so it says to all panelists and attendees in your chat.
Oh, and attendees. Okay.
Because so she didn't see that. You can send it back to her now.
Can she see it now, or do I need to retype?
You have to retype it.
Seven.
We have a few people in the viewing the webinar. We'll be starting at about 6 o'clock, so we just have a few more minutes. I'm glad that you're here. It's good to have people here.
Karen? For some reason, I cannot see the bottom of my screen where you have all like the chat and the share screen. It is.
Hey, Darren?
Yes.
Can you check your chat?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Or chat, yeah, the Zoom chat.
Oh, I'm in.
Oh, the Zoom chat.
Yeah.
Okay. Howdy. I feel like playing my Fight the Power, but I'm not going to play it.
You could play one song at 6 o'clock.
No.
One song.
That he chooses?
One song.
You want me to play a song? No, I don't want to play no music. No music. Because then I got to unset this up.
Yep.
So we're going to leave it just like this.
Okay.
Oh, you can't play the music, and you would have to take this down to play the music?
Well,
You can't do it simultaneously?
Probably not. I haven't experimented yet, but I don't want to experiment it while we live. So
Yeah. Because we
I'll
1
get to
minute
know that.
to
I'll
1
get to
minute,
figure
1
that
minute to live.
Yep.
We are
Oh, we are
already
live.
live.
Yeah.
1 minute to start.
1 minute to start. Yeah.
Welcome to those who have joined us both on Facebook and in the webinar. We'll be starting very shortly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say, like
Oh, okay.
5 minutes.
So there are some participants who raised your hands. If you have questions, if you write them in the chat, we'll be able to see them.
One second.
So I think we should get started.
Are we ready, Dr. Allen? Are we ready, panelists?
1 second.
Okay.
Darren, I just
Yes.
called you. I need you to pick up the phone.
Okay. Okay. Let me, okay. Go ahead. I have it. I know. I'm gonna take care of it. She sent the new one already. When I drop this, I'll bring the new one back up. Okay.
Okay.
While you're talking. All right.
Hi, Brenda. Welcome.
Oh, we got a number of people that's in right now. So good. I'm excited about this program. We ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Welcome everyone. My name is Darren Tolliver. I want to welcome you first to what we call ARC TV and what we try to do to educate the community. My name is Darren Tolliver. I'm your host. And we are here today for a very, very interesting panel discussion held by some really, really esteemed individuals. The topic of today is we're going to take a closer look how racism became the new pandemic. A closer look how racism became the new pandemic. It's very important, particularly in these times, that we discuss this. But let's see how this first started. Initially, we had a great conversation back around early April, and it was one of our Wednesday noontime lunch series, and it was called The World We Live In, Connecting, Coping, and Conversing. And during this time period, we had some great energy and synergies being passed around, and we had Dr. Marie Ellis and everyone, and she came up with an idea of, hey, well, maybe with the ideas floating around, maybe we should write this up. And they agreed. They thought it was an excellent idea. And I tell you, I read the article. It is phenomenal. It is on point. So that's where we're at today. And thank you to Dr. Marlene Ellis for making that recommendation. So that's where we're at right now. Moving forward, we're going to have a great panel discussion, and we're also hosted with my colleague Colleen Nguyen, who's going to also move forward and kind of help us facilitate the process. Colleen?
Yes, good evening, everybody. So We have gathered here today a group of what I would consider to be experts, and I'm basing that on the extensive research that they had to do to pen this article. And the article is How Racism Became the New Pandemic. And I know, looking at everybody that's on this panel, that this is going to be a very lively and interactive discussion. So what I'll ask each one of you to do is to please get involved throughout the program by asking some difficult and some really thought-provoking questions and pose those to the panelists. You can leave your questions in our chat and we will read them throughout the discussion. So without further ado, let me introduce our esteemed panelists. I'll start with Dr. Valerie Allen. Dr. Allen, excuse me one second. Dr. Allen brings to the panel, to the position, extensive experience as a counselor and career development officer with the Philadelphia Job Corps. She holds a BA in criminology from Indiana University of Pennsylvania and an MSW and DSW from the University of Pennsylvania. A dissertation entitled Educational Entertainment as an Intervention for Adolescents Exposed to Community Violence is published online at ProPress and Scholarly Commons. Dr. Allen has also co-written articles with Dr. Phyllis Solomon on the same topic for the Journal of Prevention and Intervention in the Community and the Journal of Human Behavior in the Social Environment. Dr. Allen is focused on addressing the needs and interests of the Penn community and on improving the quality of life of faculty, staff, and students with a particular focus on those of African descent. And let me also say that Dr. Allen is my boss. Next, we have Dr. Marlene Ellis. Dr. Ellis is a freelance copywriter and researcher who completed her PhD at Goldsmiths, the University of London, researching the experience of Black students at further education community colleges. Currently, Dr. Marlene is working on a new work entitled Race, Intersectionality, and Post-Compulsory Education, the Untold Story of Black Students, and that should be coming out in 2022. Dr. Marlene research interests include identity politics, transracial identities, gender, Black sexualities, and class intersections, political activism in the African diaspora, and Black women's health. We also have Dr. Zakia Gates, and she is the Assistant Professor at Education at Caprini University. Her research interests include critical race theory, critical theory in education, gender education with a strong emphasis on Black women and academic and societal navigation, historical and cultural memory, and culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogy in urban education. And we have Ms. Alucie Segun, and she is a public health professional with 7 years of health experience, both domestically and internationally. Her areas of expertise are mental health, health communication, nutrition, and family planning. Alucie holds a Bachelor of Arts in Print Journalism and French from American University. She is currently pursuing a Master of Social Work at Columbia University. Her interests include Black, Brown, immigrant mental health, entertainment education, and helping others pen their stories. And that's our esteemed panelists. Now our panelists will take 5 minutes each to talk about their section of the article. We'll start with Dr. Zakia Gates, and then we'll have Dr. Marlene Ellis, Ms. Alucie Segun, and Dr. Valerie Allen. And I'll turn it over to my panelists.
Thank you so much, Colleen and Darren, for this opportunity. So I'm going to go into the historical context of my piece and the mistreatment of Black bodies. So the historical context will hopefully provide a lens to explain the mistreatment of Black bodies and how we got to the whole COVID-19 pandemic, but also how this historical context attributes to the disproportionate data between African Americans and their white counterparts. This historical context of the mistreatment of Black bodies is not only defined, but is also classified as a system of differences that are structured in our society, coupled with the morbid curiosity of African Black bodies. This unfortunately has resulted into subhuman doctrines which help to frame the racial and socialized stereotypes coined for African Americans as being apes or savages or other references to animals. This was used to also justify detrimental surgical procedures and dissections of African Black bodies. And some of those examples I will begin with here. So I'm going to talk about Sarah Sargee Bartman. Sarah Sargee Bartman was of South Africa. She was considered to be a European fascination due to her large frame of buttocks and hips. Therefore, she was put on display as a freak of nature until her death in 1815. From there, her body was then dissected and objectified by George Cuvier, who preserved her brain and genitals in what's now called the Paris Museum of Man. So it wasn't until Nelson Mandela and his strong persuasion over a period of 8 years prior to his death, he had her remains returned to her country of origin so that she can rest peacefully among our ancestors. We have Jesse Washington and Mrs. Lucy Freyer. Jesse Washington was 17 years old when he was unfortunately found guilty of the murder of this white woman, Lucy Freyer. Upon his conviction, Washington's body was castrated, as many Black men were at that time, and then put on display in a public lynching in 1916. This was also similar, if we bring this up into today, the murder of Trayvon Martin, who was the same age as Jesse Washington, where he was suspected by George Zimmerman of starting trouble. So as a result, as with Jesse Washington, Trayvon Martin was also killed, and his picture of his dead body was also put on display, not only in the courtroom during to Zimmerman's conviction, but his picture was also displayed among social media, to which members of the privileged group or dominant society began to make mockeries of his death by using Skittles spread around their own bodies. So therefore, this mistreatment is aligned to the spectacle lynching. But in addition to this spectacle lynching, the gun that was also used to kill Trayvon Martin was then sold on the internet for a substantial amount of money. Next, we have Black women and James Marion Sims. So furthermore, into the morbid curiosity of Black bodies, James Marion Sims is well known for his surgical procedures on enslaved Black women. James Marion Sims, he never received any type of training in gynecology, but to the language supremacy of the English Western cultural lexicon of language, he was coined as the father of modern gynecology. So Sims experimented on the bodies of enslaved Black women by withholding anesthesia because of this subhuman doctrine that Blacks were 3/5 of a human being. So this led to this whole belief that Black women felt less pain than their white female counterparts. So one example of this today, by comparing this pain, is the story of Serena Williams. So when Serena Williams was in labor with her own daughter, she complained of this very substantial pain that she could not really find was attributed to this, and she needed a remedy in order to suppress that pain. Because of this subhuman doctrine, it's assumed that because of this, her doctors ignored her request overall. This led us to Henrietta Lacks, who was an African-American woman who was diagnosed with cervical cancer in 1951. Through this experimentation, through radiation treatment for her cervical cancer, it was found that her cells were quite unique to the point that her cells could actually survive outside of the human body. So this uniqueness of her cells led to the removal of 2 samples from the tumor without her consent. And this was considered to be an unethical practice in the field of medicine. So what remains to be maybe unseen today or maybe seen of today is whether or not her descendants were actually compensated due to this unethical practice of medicine. So this brings us to another racially charged medical curiosity, which is called the Tuskegee experiment. So this includes poor Black men who were used in this experiment. Now, other sources have coined this experiment as a study, but this was only served as a cover-up to the real goal and objective of this experiment, which was assumed to be the genocide of African Black bodies. So the Tuskegee experiment occurred from 1932 over a 40-year period and supposedly ended in 1972, where poor Black men were assumed to be used as guinea pigs for the treatment of syphilis. So unbeknownst to the participants of this experiment, the Black men were not given any real purpose of the study, nor were they even given any notice of any treatments of this disease. So therefore, this mistreatment of the African Black body, in this case, the African male Black body, continued throughout the years as other institutes and even society at large wanted to actually examine this pathology of how Black male bodies had deteriorated over the years with symptoms such as dementia and even organ damage, which included their eyes, their brain, and nerves. And as a result of this, many of their family members, especially their wives, became infected with this disease as well. This brings us to yellow fever. And I felt that in order to more so address the historical context, we cannot leave out the addressing of Black bodies and the assumed immunity from diseases and viruses. So yellow fever was first identified in the city of Philadelphia, and it was believed that it arrived from the Caribbean, but was only known as the American plague. So its origin through its transmission came from that of a female mosquito in West Africa, where white colonizers did not consider themselves to be a transmitter of the virus. So with the morbidity of the Black body, I'm sorry about that. Wait, something happened with my screen here. So basically from that, it was more so aligned with this subhuman doctrine that, again, Blacks were not, they were more so immune from that particular disease. Sorry about that. My computer's really acting up right now on this side. And for some reason, I don't see the slides on my end. I don't see anything on my end, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't see the slides either. Did you take, there they go.
Okay, all right. So I think I ended with, and I can't see it, yellow fever. And it was one more.
1 second, let's see what's going on.
Okay, because it took something else for me too.
We want to thank you for being patient as well.
Dr. Gates, your next point is around the trust versus mistrust relationship between patients and practitioners.
Okay, thank you. Let me finish with the last one. Okay, all right, because it was yellow fever I left off on. So pretty much I left it with the white colonizers and what they did not consider themselves to be transmitters of this disease. So with that morbidity of the Black body and its relation to this particular virus, there was a doctor named Dr. John Lennon who wrote the first published description of the yellow fever and its influence in North America. So he did in fact identify the immunity of the virus, but he only identified that immunity among white Americans. So a racialized resistance of accepting African Americans as human beings, this doctor assumed that yellow fever among Black Americans was either considered a natural occurrence or a natural immunity. So this further desensitized the African Black body so that white colonizers or what have you would more so believe that we just were able to more so endure pain, but it more so morphed into this imagination to white minds that, you know, we can pretty much just take pain and not be immune to that. And that led to the trust versus mistrust. So I'll just end it here. It took away something else I had too. But I'm sorry about that. My computer's acting up. I'm so sorry. So sorry about this. But it's pretty much my assumption based on these findings that this led to the trust versus mistrust. And I want to use my words very, very carefully because this is only an assumption. This is not to say this has actually happened, but based on some of the historical context that I have provided and some of the dissections and I'm going to say illegal surgical procedures on Black bodies is only my assumption as to why, as a collective, can't really talk too much of individual, but as a collective, why there is this trust versus mistrust. But in particularly when it comes to African-American males and this whole notion of we just don't go to the doctor. So, but thank you.
You're on mute, Colleen, if you're talking.
Is Colleen with us?
I am.
She's on mute.
Okay, so I was saying, Dr. L. Oh, Zakia, we don't have any questions right now at this time, so we could move on to Dr. Ellis.
Yes, good evening, and thank you very much to the African American Resource Center for giving me this opportunity. It's been great being here as an English person, working with you all. And it obviously with the pandemic, it started to think about what has the germ theory got to do with all of this idea of the coronavirus. I had no idea what the germ theory was, but yet we were having all these discussions about vaccinations and what was the history in relation to us. So I realized some shocking things that I think we ought to become more aware of. And essentially, first of all, I want to introduce you to a man called Louis Pasteur, a French chemist with the emphasis on chemist, and a Dr. Robert Koch, who was a German scientist. Now, the germ theory is popularized by Louis Pasteur. And I want you to understand, he's a sort of early, in the middle to late 19th century. He's a chemist, which means he's a tradesman that sells drugs. And that's significant, not a scientist, not a doctor, but a chemist of his time. And essentially, the germ theory that he popularized is what we function with today. And the idea is germs are microorganisms that exist in the body, in the air, destroying our cells. And therefore, they must be attacked in order to protect, cut and slice. We use surgery, we use chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and we were always in the pursuit of a vaccine. What's the new vaccine? And it's also important to know at that time that there was the development of science that hadn't really been established in the medical profession against the sort of establishment of homeopathy, traditional remedies, herbal remedies. And they were seen as a sort of a competition, if you like, against this new evolution of medical science. So we have this idea that comes into germs have to be attacked. They are there, they've got one single purpose, to kill the body. And then Robert Koch develops this, and actually I think wins a Nobel Peace Prize for his work on tuberculosis. But there's somebody in opposition also of his time, they were adversaries, called Dr. Antoine Beauchamp, who said the idea of treating germs as external to the body is a mistake. In fact, germs, he says, are part of the body. And actually, they're signifying that there is an imbalance in the body. So he has this kind of complex. Now, Dr. Antoine Beauchamp was a very highly reputable scientist of his time. But unlike Louis Pasteur, he was not connected to the higher echelons of society. He was a man who was a dedicated man, highly revered of his time for the work he did diligently in his science. The terrain theory was to say that when you look at disease, you have not just to look at the particular focus of the bacteria that you see, but the whole terrain of the body. And this was completely dismissed. And the idea for Beauchamp is just that the cells, they change according to the imbalance of the body. So they might start of a virus, a bacteria, to a fungi, to a mold, and that you can't just see them as a single thing. Whereas Pasteur's position and Robert Koch was that no, they are invaders, they are attacking the cells, and we must prevent them from attack. And that relationship is very important when it comes to race, this idea of protection and attack. So I do want to say also that look, this is the evolution of science. These ideas aren't particularly new, but they're trying to create a scientific world for them to build this new pharmaceutical sort of environment. So so what happens is that as they grow in development, you've then got the emergence of the eugenic scientists at the same time. So you have Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin, introducing and building on the eugenicist ideas. Eugenicists have the idea of the genes, the survival of the fittest, the best genes are the white middle classes, and we must control the feeble-minded, because if we don't control the feeble-minded gene, they're going to reproduce and we're not going to have a high quality society. Needless to say, those that were the feeble-minded, the weaker genes, included very much us as Africans, African Americans, the indigenous populations, Jewish people, white working classes. This is the same as in England. So the idea is you can join the germ with the gene in order then to have good productivity over this idea of the germ theory. Now, not all germ theorists believed it was necessary that there was a relationship between the survival of the fittest. Let's face it, the germ idea was a non-discriminatory. You got the disease or you didn't. The germ didn't identify who was white, who was black, who was poor, who was disabled. But this was actually what was proffered and remains the strong arguments of the day. But once you once you conjoin the germ and the gene, what happened then was that the growth of sterilizing Black people grew. Over 60,000 African Americans were sterilized in a period of about 30 years, over 30 states, over a very short, I think it was about, was it 10, 20, 30 years? The sterilization of Black people became highly acceptable, and inevitably the attack on Black women. Together with that idea anyway, that we feel less pain, there were lots of attacks on destroying these communities through the use of being able to converse the germ and the gene. Once you join the germ and the gene, and you say that Black people, if germs attack weak bodies, if weak bodies have weak genes, then germs live in Black bodies. Black bodies are genes, Black bodies are the infectious disease. We become the embodiment of disease and not just the carrier. We are the disease. Mm-hmm. So this has cemented something so great that we've never actually escaped. But I think the important thing to think about is that, look, in the American Civil War, 2/3 of soldiers died from disease, not from gunshots. All these diseases, dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, yellow fever, smallpox, tuberculosis, and gangrene, they've all suffered from the idea of poor contact, poor contamination of food, cross-contamination from feces to food, clean water, lack of clean water, and so on. They all are grounded in the cleanliness and balance of nature. So where are we? What the position that we are fighting is not just that we are dying of the coronavirus, COVID-19, but that we are seen as the virus. So we see in China are now trying to position us as the people to get away from. There's huge, awful treatment of Africans now in China. We see with Dr. Fauci in his positioning, his explanation that there's no correlation between loss of Black life and the pandemic. He says it's just mere comorbidities. It's just the fact that there were aggravating things like these additional diabetes and so on. You see, that is the voice of systemic racism, refusing to acknowledge the relationship between comorbidity and the fact that Black people are dying. It's not one or the other. It is related. And the question is not that, oh no, it's not this, but that, but to look at the systemic ideas behind why that makes it so. So in the article, we were able to look at some of the examples of what happens where we have poor quality water. Black children suffer with higher levels of lead, much higher, 3 times higher sometimes than white Americans, through no fault of their own. So the question about this germ theory is that we need to understand much more about our relationship between how we take more responsibility for ourselves. That we cannot do everything, but we have to actually get to know much more about a resistance, I think. It's foolish to say don't respond to vaccinations, but it's extremely important that we understand much more about the relationship between the Black body, our health, and the germ theory, with the suggestion that we ought to be challenging the very notion of this germ theory and this relationship it has to eugenic scientists that are still in the background, but very much still alive. I don't know how I've gone for time there. So I'll stop there.
Okay.
And
Okay, so we do have a question and I'd like to read it and you could answer it. This is from Chavez and it says, why do you think there is such an attack against the Black bodies when it is a fact that melanin is valued even greater than gold or any other naturally derived resource on Earth, making the notion of Black bodies being virus bodies? This is not including the fact that Black bodies encompass natural minerals and other antibodies that are still not even known to us in the natural world or any other race. So I guess her question is, why do you think there's such an attack against Black bodies?
well, I think you've answered the question, quite honestly. Look, the truth is, if we look at white anxiety, the truth is our ability to reproduce ourselves it's not equal, is it? The ability for white people to reproduce themselves is far more challenging. If we mix together, of course, we produce black people. Whether we want to get into these ideas of biracial or mixed race, which I think we ought to reject, but I think at the heart of all this is that white anxiety. Now, how do we control? These are legacies from slavery. These are things that they were existing before slavery. The sterilization of us was in existence before slavery. The destruction of Africans in Southwest Africa existed before the Jewish Holocaust by the same people. So these things aren't new, but it becomes, it's colonialism updating itself. How do you contain the power of the African people? And like you say, in biological terms, you could say there's no competition, precisely for the reasons that you give.
Excellent, excellent. I just want to take a minute to tell anyone from Facebook, if you are watching and you have some questions, please put the questions and you can post them on Facebook and continue to post your questions and comments in our chat section. Colleen?
Yes, and we did have another question and it was from Judea and she wanted to know where do we go from here, but we will tackle that question later on in our discussion. Thank you, Dr. Ellis. And next we'll have Lucie Sagoon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marlene and Dr. Zakia. It was great to have the background that you put together and just laying out the information around the historical context as well as the germ theory, as it'll help better explain the section that I'm currently doing. So one of the aspects that we spoke about during this paper was, this is kind of how the paper came about. Dr. Marlene we were speaking and she was kind of like, where is the data around who was dying? We were starting to receive information, but it wasn't disaggregated by race yet. So it was just this lump sum of all of these persons are dying, and this whole idea that COVID was some kind of great equalizer of persons. However, when we dug a little deeper, we started to realize that, of course, that actually is not the case. Next slide, please.
Yep.
So for the purpose of the impact of COVID-19 on frontline workers, these were the 4 case studies that we used. Wando Evans, who worked at Walmart in Chicago, he died at 51 years of age. He was another frontline worker who was working in a facility where it wasn't necessarily being properly taken care of. And furthermore, there was not a lot of transparency. So let's say another colleague had been infected, no one else knew, people weren't aware of what was going on. And this is similarly the case for Leilani Jordan, 27 years old. She worked at a grocery store in Largo, Maryland. And this was before the time of understanding that anybody who's coming in contact with any persons, even if there is 6 foot of distance, everyone should be wearing any kind of protective gear. So her colleagues and her were not using any protective gear, and she lost her life on March 26th. And we have Jason Hargrove, who most of us know his story quite well. Jason Hargrove created the viral video where we saw him complaining about a woman on, or honestly, not even complaining, just illustrating how the, this lack of consideration for other persons. A woman comes on a bus and she is coughing. And I think about 11 days later, Jason Hargrove contracts COVID-19. We don't know if there's any kind of correlation between those two, but he contracts COVID-19. And what is interesting about his case is that he goes to the hospital and he talks to the doctors about his symptoms. He had a fever, he was coughing, and they told him just to self-quarantine. So he goes and self-quarantines. Again, he starts not feeling very well. His fever is spiking. And additionally, he is having issues with his circulation. His fingers are turning blue. He goes back again to the hospital and they said he should just continue quarantining, as at that time his fever did drop a bit. But when his wife mentioned, what about the case of the circulation? It was something that didn't need to be worried about right now. 3 days later, he comes into the hospital. 3 days later, he dies of COVID. And the last case study that we also focused on was that of Carlene Summers. Carlene Summers was working with the United States Postal Service in White Plains, New York, and she was infected with COVID-19 and eventually ended up passing it on to her husband. But apparently, Ms. Summers told the nurse who was focusing on or just taking care of all the COVID-19 cases that she had contracted COVID, and apparently the people who she came in contact with were not alerted of that. And there were people who were openly sick who were still working. Can I have the next slide? So just kind of understanding this, I think it's fascinating when you understand the case studies and see how this has directly affected people when you look at, okay, this specific individual. But I do think it's important as well to understand how we even got here in the first place. So I'll just highlight a few key points, as we're not going to go through everything, but December 31st, 2019 was when there was even any kind of indication that there was some pneumonia-like illness going on in Wuhan, China. And eventually this virus gets the name of SARS-CoV-2, so severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. And then by January 17th, we see that the US confirms its first case of coronavirus, which is a man in Washington state who traveled to Wuhan. So there were many clear indications that clearly something was going on. As if we continue following the news, we see that the province of Wuhan, or Hubei province with its capital city, Wuhan, which has 60 million persons, they essentially go on a 2.5-month lockdown, but it's as if nobody's really paying attention, as there were other distracting factors on our end with what was happening in our government. But after we learned that this individual contracts COVID-19, we finally have our first case of our death from COVID-19 on February 29th. And at this point, the governor of Washington state, as it took place in Seattle, enacts a state of emergency. But then again, looking at that time difference, December 31st, 2019, we then learn what coronavirus is. We see Wuhan go on a complete shutdown, essentially. Then we see that we have our first case, but it's not until the 29th of February that there's even any talk of any kind of quarantining or social distancing on our end. Next slide. So furthermore, we start seeing the numbers spike. We see that New York City, which eventually becomes the epicenter of the virus in the United States and actually globally as well, we start off in the US at around 69 cases. And it's interesting because by the time it's March 15th, we are at 3,000 cases. And it might not seem like that large amount of time, but it just shows you how contagious COVID-19 can be, as our understanding at that point was that it's only people who had traveled to Wuhan or if somebody is clearly ill. But at this point, we're still not fully understanding the fact that transmission can take place through asymptomatic individuals. And even to this day, it's not clear, as I'm sure some of you recently saw that the World Health Organization came out and they said that they're still not sure of how asymptomatic individuals spread the coronavirus, or if that's still fully plausible, to which Dr. Fauci completely shut down that doesn't make any sense. So we see that the cases have risen to 3,000. And by March 18th, again, we have some kind of guidance coming out from the White House stating that we shouldn't gather in groups more than 10 persons. Then we finally have our first stay-at-home order, which is March 19th. At this point, this is almost 2 months even after what we were seeing happening in Wuhan. So by March 31st, this is at the end of the month, we started off March 1st with 69 cases. And by March 31st, there were 162,000 cases in the United States. So the case study that we focused on, Jason Hargrove, we see that he passes away on April 1st. And shortly after, we see that the CDC issues the guidance that people should wear face coverings. There's a lot of controversy around, is COVID-19 aerosolized? It's not something that's fully clear. And the only reason that even came into play is the transmission rates weren't adding up. So it didn't fully make sense to people. But I think what is fascinating is that even though we started to see this trend that Black persons were losing their lives, it took so long for us to even put the dots together. And for me, it just always indicates that Black lives are disposable. During the Black Plague, there were the individuals who were taking care of the bodies. I'm sure we've all seen it in the all Black suits with the bird kind of face. They were actually people experiencing leprosy. So leprosy did not have any cure, and they were the ones responsible for taking the bodies and the like. So one of them would come believing that they have leprosy, there's no cure to it, and they would die. And then they would be subsequently replaced by somebody else. And it feeds back into what we were saying earlier about who is considered essential, and just look at the way these things were even handled, not having appropriate care. And even if you don't necessarily have the PPE, for example, the facilities weren't being taken care of, they weren't being properly maintained. Next slide. So I'll go a little faster here as running out of time, but so yeah, the inequality is in the numbers. We look at New York State, in which when we don't focus on New York City, New York State has a population that is 9% Black. However, they were 17% of the state COVID-19 deaths. So all of this data is as of today, June 23rd. And that's almost essentially a 2%. They are twice the number of persons in their population who contracted COVID. And the same for Latinx Americans, 14% of the population, yet 12% of the state's COVID-19 deaths. And we see that even in Michigan as well, something similar is happening, in which 5.2% of their state population is Latinx, yet 83% of them are the ones who were the COVID-19 deaths. So this is the whole illustration that at times doesn't make sense to people. If someone is 9% of the state's population, and at the time when we edited this, it was 18%, so that's a ratio of 2. And if we put 14 over 12, that would give us a ratio of about 1.16. So if we're putting them all with the sake of proportionality, when we put, at that point, it was 60 over 74, that's not even one whole. So there's no reason that that would make such a case where such a small percentage of the population would be so disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Next slide. And just looking back again, we're still collecting information through the CDC, but what they have so far is that 22% of the cases of coronavirus in the United States were in the Black population, 33% in the Latin American population, and 34.7% in the white population. So again, just kind of illustrating that disproportionality, as if we're such a small percentage of the population, there's no reason why we should represent so many of the COVID-19 cases. Next slide. So the health conditions that were said to be susceptible to COVID-19, we were taught that people who are immunodeficient, those who are experiencing obesity, asthma, and diabetes. So an example of someone who is immunodeficient would be somebody who has HIV/AIDS. HIV/AIDS rates are higher in Black populations than any other population in the United States. As per obesity, 4 out of 5 Americans are obese. And when it comes to asthma, we are the leading population of persons with asthma, as are also those who identify as Native American. And for diabetes as well, Black Americans also lead the percentage of persons who are experiencing diabetes. And as I'm over time, I would just quickly go on to the next slide and call it a day. But we look at all of these things, and it's similar to what Dr. Marlene was saying. We keep talking about comorbidity, 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 but nobody wants to seem to put those things together. If we see that people have worse health outcomes, for example, if they're experiencing obesity, yet the majority of persons who live in Black and brown populations or who live in food deserts are Black and brown people, it makes perfect sense that if you don't have access to nutritious food, yet you're still consuming food, but you are malnourished, you're undernourished or overnourished in that sense. So we see that as the case. Environmental degradation, the individuals most likely to live in areas where there are landfills are Black and brown persons. And even the case of just redlining in general, where we are, because of where we're living, we don't have as much access to things, and it just continues making this cycle of poverty and poor health. So I'm over time, but that is it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So do I go next?
Colleen? We want to also remember to, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or if you're on Facebook, please list any questions that you want to ask the panelists, okay?
Before you start, Dr. Allen, we do have 2 questions, and the 2 questions I'm going to combine because they are looking at the fear that the African-American community may be targeted where the government will start with the vaccine. And one in particular was looking at in the UK, the BAME community. And the other question was saying that, we know that it takes about 10 to 15 years for a vaccine or a drug to arrive on the market. So knowing this, and they're trying to fast track the vaccine, how might this panel recommend addressing the community's valid concerns?
Can I suggest that we hold that question to when we start talking about where we're going and what needs to happen? But could you bring that question back up?
Yes, I will. Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Valerie Allen.
Okay, so I am going to try to connect some of these things by talking about trauma, because a lot of what has happened to Black and brown people in the United States has caused trauma. So trauma is a result of a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. And when the deep emotional wounds of trauma are repetitive, long-term, and pervasive, it causes complex psychological trauma. And the symptoms of complex psychological trauma are very similar to PTSD. So you have fatalistic coping skills, difficulty with development of pro-social skills, and moral behavior. There have been studies that have explored individual symptomatology, but there has been limited studies to explore the impact of traumatic events that occur for multiple generations. So we were exploring, by looking at the history, by looking back, we explored that generational trauma through the lens of historical trauma theory. And that says that trauma that is collective and compounded by events that occur at different periods across generations can be seen as a single part of a single traumatic trajectory. So it's not one event that happens, but it is the combination of all the events that happen over a period of time and that is universally experienced by a population of people. And it also forces that population of people away from its natural trajectory. So the thing about trauma is that it doesn't just affect us socially and emotionally, but physiologically. So when we talk about the comorbid diseases that we carry with COVID, a lot of that is because of our physiological changes in our body as a result of trauma. there's a correlation between stress and physical illness. And epigenetics explores the physical impact of trauma across generations. There's another theorist by the name of Dr. Joy DeGroy, and she called the results of our historic trauma post-traumatic slave syndrome. She goes further to say that our injuries from slavery are further exacerbated by the continued existence of structural and institutional racism. Now, I want to help you to really understand that. So I want to take you on a trip with me. It's 1770, and you are a 12-year-old African girl who survived the Middle Passage. You arrive to this new land where you and those who were brought here with you are stripped, chained, separated from each other, and sold. You get to your new home where you witness other Black bodies beaten, raped, forced to work and serve. You yourself are raped, and you give birth to a child that is ripped from your arms and sold away. Your child never knew what happened to his mother, but witnessed those same things happen where he was. Fast forward many, many generations of Black bodies raped, beaten, killed, sold, separated from family. Then they were freed to be raped, beaten, killed with no consequences for the perpetrators. Then those same bodies were used for experimentation by the medical field. So you heard us talk about the Tuskegee experiments, Henrietta Lacks, sterilization experiments, and again, no consequences for the perpetrator. Then we have the civil rights movement, and you begin to think things might be getting better. And then we have Bloody Sunday and Bull Connor, and then the police brutality of the 70s and the 80s, and then Rodney King, Latasha Harkins. Then we elect a Black president and we say, okay, things are going to get a little better. There's just a glimmer of hope. And then we have Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, and then Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. If you think that you are not physiologically impacted by trauma, take your heart rate right now. Just hearing those things causes our stress levels to rise. There is a physiological impact of all the trauma that we feel. Add to that the continued mistreatment by healthcare. As was stated earlier, the highest infant mortality rate, the highest rate for most illnesses, the highest death rate for women with breast cancer. I mean, when you add all of that, and then add the disproportionality of the way we are impacted by COVID-19, there is definitely a virus in the United States, and that virus is called racism.
Wow. I think we're all left here checking our own pulse rates after you just said that. So thank you so much for that. Colleen?
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you, panelists. So I want to thank you all for giving an overview of each one of your areas. And so now I want to ask some specific questions from each of you. Given what is currently happening in the United States, could you please talk about how writing this piece was for you? And you can start, anybody can start.
I'll start with that.
Okay.
I'm going to be extremely bold and very honest, because this is something that in our communities is not very well sometimes received and acknowledged or respected. But I was emotional throughout. You know, I had to do it with logic and ethics because this is a piece that we're writing, but it was extremely, for me, overwhelming. Because just reading back to, you know, these mistreatment of Black bodies and what Dr. Valerie just harped upon with the trauma, just writing the piece, I had to just sometimes take a break at times and just realize that this is actually for real. This has happened, and this continues to happen. And I'm trying to be as optimistic as possible. I hope it doesn't continue. However, I'm conflicted in my own brain that it just may continue. So where do we go from here? I know we're going to address that, but I'm at a loss myself. So that was my take in
Okay,
writing.
thank you, Dr. Gates. Anyone else?
Yeah, sure. Similar to what Dr. Zakia said, I think this is one of the first times that in one of these experiences with what has happened currently with Ahmaud or George Floyd or Breonna, to actually sit down and be able to fully take it in as we're in the pandemic season. So a lot of us have more times with ourselves. So you're finally just sitting in it. And I think finally understanding that, wow, we literally saw a human being killed by somebody putting their knee on their neck it's something that is still pretty unbelievable to me. And I did have to definitely take breaks in writing this, as I did definitely feel traumatized during this process of writing this. I've learned a lot through reading everyone else's sections, but even I think beyond being a Black person, anyone who is seeing what's currently happening, I would be shocked if they didn't feel any sense of rage or just sadness or fear when you see that other persons can be treated as such.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay.
I just want to say, I just want to say, very much appreciate this recognition of the people that have died in America. And often in England, we say that, oh, America over there, it's not as bad as it is in England. We're not as crazy. The Americans are crazy. We don't have these problems. We have exactly the same problems. And proportionately, we have the same problems. We have many, many people that have died. And Mark Duggan, Sean Rigg, there are many that, I could take them all the way up my arm, the amount of Black people that have died in police custody, one way or the other. And one of the challenges for us is to recognize that this thing is a global problem. This idea that it's specific to America, this health problem. We have a health problem in America that's a private system. We have a public system in the UK, and yet none of this makes any difference when it comes to the loss of Black life.
Yeah. Can I also just add to that? When we started working on this project, it was pre-George Floyd. It was pre-Ahmaud Arbery. And so when those things happened, and we had already begun to examine racism in the institution of medicine and healthcare in America. And when those things happen, I think one of the things that happens is that when we have the little glimmer of hope, we try to hold on to that. And I think that that's a mistake. I think that we always have to be realistic. So someone asked in the chat about how we get past the Stockholm syndrome, which is feeling affection for your captors. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is to really be brutally honest about the way the United States and our government has treated us since we've been here, since before we got here, how they treated the indigenous people who were here before they came here. So to start off with just kind of looking at COVID and how we were impacted by that and knowing the racism in that, and then seeing how it just is so widespread, it is very, it's emotional. It was emotional to do that. And there were times through this process where all I could do was cry.
Right.
So I think it's very difficult. And I think that in order to get past the Stockholm syndrome takes time, and it really takes some honest examination of who we are and who we are to America.
Thank you. Just listening to a lot of the information that you already provided has been very emotional for me. My next question is, most of us, when we have a project that we have to tackle, we have an end game in mind. So what did you hope to accomplish in penning this article?
Well, I think for me, I I realized when this pandemic was happening that I needed to get myself informed, you know, that I think I was trying to educate myself about it. That's the first time I've lived through a pandemic. I didn't know what was going on. And I myself was very afraid, you know, I continue to be afraid. So these questions that everybody else is asking, you know, what part can we take care of for ourselves? What part's our responsibility that we can take more responsibility for? What part should we reject? Like, what is the position about the vaccine? These are the questions that I was asking for myself and realized I had no answer at that time. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Would anybody else like to address that question?
So I think along with what Dr. Ellis just said and what I was saying earlier, I just think it's real important that we as a people understand everything that is happening. So one of the things that when we initially started with COVID was that we were told Black people didn't get it. You know, we were saying, oh yeah, this is a disease that's going to miss us. So therefore, we didn't start off separating and feel that it was so important that we self-isolate. We didn't start off there. And so it left us vulnerable. And part of the issue is that we have been so mistreated and misled by the institution of medicine that we tend not to trust it when they say it. There are still people that say, this isn't real. So for me, it was, we need to get the message out that yes, this is real. Yes, we are getting it. Yes, we need to make some changes. And we have to find a way to get past some of our distrust.
Yeah.
At the same time, not losing sight of it, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Before we move on, does anybody else want to answer that really quickly? Okay. So at this time, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Darren Tolliver.
Thank you, Colleen. And this is questions to the panelists as well, the esteemed panelists, and you guys have done an excellent job to this point. Many would say it would be in our best interest as people to move beyond our historical trauma. How do we begin to do that when we are constantly re-traumatized by incidents of racism and the modern day lynchings of our own people?
Well, I think that the only remedy for fear and stress and trauma is action. There is nothing else as an antidote to this than action. So it is about when you take action, you're challenging your fears. So it's very much about then what action do we take? What are the strategies to take? In England, there's an organization called Stop the Maangamizi. Maangamizi itself is a Swahili name to take control of the ongoing Holocaust of an African people. I think that it's essential that we see ourselves as African people with a global problem. This is not just an African-American problem. As a matter of fact, more Africans are dying in the South than they are in the North. And they aren't being reported because we could also argue that the value of the North African American is higher than the South American. So then if it's about action, what action do we take? And one of the things that we have to do is be honest about, what bit can you do that furthers the movement forward? And for me, the movement foremost is about, first of all, understanding there's a global African problem, and that's the struggle we should be a part of. We should reject to an extent the nationalization of us, because the pattern keeps repeating itself. And if you look at Europeans, they always work together. They meet G5, G7, G10, whatever it is, they always communicate together.
Okay.
They recognize they have a global relationship. And that's what we have to do, a very similar thing.
Okay. Thank you for your comment. Anyone else on the panel want to address that question?
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Many would feel that it would be in our best interest as people to move beyond our historical trauma. How do we begin to do that when we are constantly re-traumatized by incidents of racism and the modern day lynchings of our own people?
Zakia, were you getting ready to say something?
I see she's shaking her head.
I'm going to be real quick. Well, we cannot get beyond the historical trauma because it's embedded in our DNA. It's there. It's already there. And I think if more of us try to move towards getting out of this white supremacy trauma trance that we're all currently under, we have to address the historical trauma. We can't, there's just no way to even get around it. It's there. It's embedded in our DNA. It's embedded in our bodies.
Yes.
And we have to deal with it. It's like going to a therapist. A therapist or a psychologist is going to always ask you, tell me about your past. What happened? This is what has happened. This is what has happened to us collectively. As Dr. Marlene said, this is global.
Yeah.
And we have to really address this global history of anti-Blackness. Yeah. This is what it is. And to really realize that this whole objective of all these pandemics, this germ theory, this infestation as to how people see us, the whole objective of that is about Black genocide, just so like it was about Native American genocide. Yes. Under white supremacy trauma trance, they realized, oh, these people did not die out as they have done. So we have to figure out something else because their DNA and their markers are telling us they can reproduce us, even though we can't see us in them. So this is all about the objective and the goal of Black genocide. And if we don't get to that point, we are cognizant of that. I know our melanin is popping. That's what they want. And it's triple, I think it's past that of gold right now, of melanin. So for them to tell us that your Blackness is a curse because you want my Blackness, this is going to be a whole get out moment like Jordan Peele.
Yes.
What's going to do?
Thank you. I seen Dr. Allen do Ashe.
That's right.
And I loved how she spoke on it in her own presentation. That was great. And here's one of the questions I want to ask to the panelists again. Are there any ways of taking advantage of the moment to address healthcare policy so that Black people don't continue to be impacted in the way we were with COVID-19?
Well, I think, taking on what Dr. Valerie was saying, that you've got to have one foot in, one foot out. I think that one of the things we have to do is understand that, read about Gavi, G-A-V-I. It's the Global Alliance of Vaccinations and Immunization. Now, there's a couple of billion pounds being put into that organization, largely funded by the Gates Foundation, and they are in Africa. And they fund sterilization and immunization. And they are the leaders in trying to get a vaccination. There's a race to get the vaccine because obviously it's the big contract, it's where the money is. Now, we need to actually just be aware of how this thing is working. And then we have to, one of the things we have to do is understand what can we do that keeps us more balanced in nature? You know, Olishay's talked about that, the nutrition, the diet, the peace, the trauma, understanding that viruses and bacteria and infection is created because of our history, these intergenerational problems we have. So we actually have to take our trauma far more seriously than we have ever done before. Because if we don't take this on board, we will feed the next virus, the next disease. Because nobody's planning to end disease. Nobody's looking for a cure. They are all looking for a vaccine. That's not the same as a cure. That's looking for the modern, the
Yes.
next treatment.
Yeah.
So we have to be concerned about that, and concerned about this one hand, it's just another treatment, and prepared for the fact another virus is going to come. It's going to come, you know, and they are anticipating that. And what is our preparation for that? And the very least we can do is get as closer to nature as possible, and to really work with this traumatic situation that we are in, that we are.
Okay. I think this brings us to our last question, and this is a question I'm pretty sure everyone who's watching us via Zoom or on Facebook want to know. Where do we go from here? This is the question that we had to ask the panelists. Where do we go from here? And I need to hear from each one of you. Where do we go from here?
I can start. When I just heard that question, I'm looking to my left right now at Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? So that has to be an open question. We have more he's sitting right here. That's like, wow. So are we going to have more chaos, as Dr. Marlene has just addressed? Because I do believe as well, there will be another virus that will come out. But I think if we still build, as Dr. King was saying, more community, it starts here with webinars and Zoom meetings like this, and keeping our Black communities, I'm saying Black communities, connected, and making sure that other people within the Black community stay educated about this. So when Dr. Marlene mentioned nutrition and balance, we have to also consider maybe certain communities who don't have that economic privilege to get to certain types of quote unquote stores or what have you to get that particular type of nutrition. So we need other programs, and I know aarc is one, and there are others as well, but I think even our organizations need to start working together in the community as well.
Excellent, excellent. Oluche, would you like to give us an answer for that one? Where do we go from here?
So one of the reasons why I went into health is that, in my experience, there are not enough persons who look like us who are in this profession and field. I think that personally, there's a lot of education that has to take place, in the sense that we are dealing with an entire generation of miseducated persons, and it's part of white supremacy that we don't know the things that we are supposed to know. So one of the things for me is even understanding health narratives and how health systems work. Even that in itself is something, because the whole point is to keep people ignorant so that these instances of injustice, this history of injustice, can continue itself. So personally for me, I think anybody who is interested in healthcare, this is your opportunity to really step up and step in right now. There are a lot of opportunities for those who want to work in healthcare to get this kind of experience, and it's invaluable, as getting to work with the CDC or something of the like is not a very easy thing to do, but it is possible and it's out there. And I'm always big on self-care. I think it was Dr. Marlene who was mentioning that Swahili proverb. I do believe in the context of Sankofa is that I think we are living in a time in which things happen and you just keep moving forward. But the whole point is that history will keep repeating itself if you're not fully grounding yourself and being present. So even as someone who identifies as Nigerian American and being in the United States, I had to learn the history of what it means to be African American, and understanding that past and how it relates to where I am as a person. As in order for you to interact in a system and to be effective, you need to understand your positionality within that system. So definitely for me, it's an education piece. Whatever you can do to get involved in healthcare, those things are very important. And please also take care of yourselves. I think that mental health is so shunned in our community, but the reality of this is that these things, they're traumatizing for anybody who's seeing any of it. To see someone like you who's continuously losing their life and essentially nothing is ever done about this. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Ellis, where do we go from here?
I personally think that this is the capitalist system is totally dependent on the exploitation of race. And therefore there is no part of this system that ought to survive, because it is so corrupted that it's difficult for me to think that one part of it can function well whilst the rest continues, such as the penal system, for example, in both the US and the UK. So one of the things that Stop the Mangamizi has a very clear structure, and what it wants to do is create a truth and reconciliation on a national and international level, so that the conversation about what's happened to us really becomes, in America, the control on live TV, so that there's a proper dialogue that really begins, which has not started yet, hasn't even begun to start, where a conversation really takes place about the experience of slavery, the ongoing consequences as a result of that. And one of the things that's really been refreshing on the marches over George Floyd is the huge amount of white people that have been present. So there is an opportunity for these to take action. There has to be political action. For me, without political action, we will be here again in 10 and 30, 50 years. Yeah. So it's about, I really support what the young people are doing, that they're out there protesting, really, I thank them and give thanks for what they're doing. But I think that we need more structured, just a clearer strategy in where we're going with this kind of reaction. It's right that we protest and we continue to protest, but I think it's a beginning if we have something like a Truth and Reconciliation, where we're talking to white communities, everybody comes forward and they speak, but with the goal of reparations at the end. There has to be reparatory justice for what has happened to us.
Thank you so much. And we're gonna finish with Dr. Allen. Dr. Allen, the same question. We talk about this and we grapple all the time. And I think that you have a great opportunity to answer this question of where do we go from here?
So the connection between race, trauma, and health disparities cannot be ignored. There is a definite relationship between public health, institutional racism, environmental racism, and eugenic racism. And we have to explore it. And more than that, we have to acknowledge it. And when I say we now, I'm not talking about we, the Black community, but the whole of this country has to acknowledge that these things happen. So we can't, as Dr. Gates said, we can't just move past it and forget it. They don't do that with the Jewish Holocaust. And there's a reason. And so we need to make sure that we understand, know, and it is acknowledged that we had a Holocaust and that we need to be given reparations. We need to be put in a position where we can, I'm sorry, I have a cat and I hate him and he just rubbed up against me. Please, just took me completely off. We need to get to a place where we can come up, okay? So I think that a couple of things. So Alucia talked about people who are interested in healthcare. I'm gonna talk about social workers, sociologists. We need to be not only educating people to be direct workers, we need macro social workers. We need people who are writing policy, who are canvassing and lobbying to the politicians. We need to vote. We need to get everybody registered. And I know some people say voting doesn't help. To some degree, I can understand where that comes from, but we can address it from a number of different angles. If you have another way to come at it that way and vote. You don't have to do one to the exclusion of the other. But we have got to make an impact. We have to make our voices heard. And so that's the one thing that I'm gonna say, and Dr. Ellis acknowledged the young people who are protesting, who are leading this protest march at this time, because their voices are being heard and they are being loud. And what I am hoping, and I always say that, is that it doesn't become a moment. It has to be a movement, and it can't be just about George Floyd. We got to make it bigger than that. We have to ground it in everything that has happened so that it doesn't become just the moment of the people that murdered him getting justice, but something that we can get justice for our people as a whole. And if you make it bigger than that, yes, Rarujirana said, a movement and a marathon. This is a marathon. This is not a sprint. We are in a marathon and we have to fight till the end. We cannot give up. That's all I have to say.
I wanted to post that truth and reconciliation with goals and reparatory justice. Excellent ideas. Colleen?
Excellent idea. So what we do have right now is you have people that have been waiting to ask some questions that they would like addressed. And I want to go back to the one that I asked earlier and you asked me to wait, because some people feel that the Black community is going to be used again as guinea pigs for this vaccination. And one person was specifically talking about UK and the BAME community. And then other people were just talking about African Americans in general. And they wanted to know, how do you address that? The vaccine that they are coming out with, how should African Americans and Black people and people of color address that issue of the vaccine coming soon to our communities?
Yeah, I think it's yeah, the UK and the US, they're very much involved in this global alliance. They're very much, leading the way in this looking for the current vaccine. And I hesitate to say, as if I were God, don't take the vaccine. In some ways, it's almost irresponsible for me to say that. What I would say to you is, you must get yourselves informed. So I will be following the progress of these vaccines. And, we have just as much worry about being sterilized. The Gavi, they are very much in Africa at the moment, and they have a very strong connection to sterilization. And they work for pharmaceutical companies, even though they do some good work. So the real truth is that we have to really dig down, keep an eye on them and see what they're doing and be informed along the way. But I say this to you, it's not good enough just to say, I'm not taking the vaccine, if you don't take responsibility for your own health at the same time. We all have to make changes. It's really about get yourself. I fully, absolutely right to say, it's easier to, if you're poor, how do you get to do, sometimes healthier food is more expensive. It's no longer going to be an excuse. There are ways in which we can eat better on poorer, on low levels, on low budgets. And we have got to go there if we are looking for our survival. So I haven't answered it straight, but I would say, keep an eye on what they're doing. The history of vaccinations, some of it's been slightly successful, some of it's been terrible. So you have to stay open, stay informed, but one thing that there is no compromise on is you have to improve your own diets, whether you're really, really poor or really, really rich, because that impacts our balance. That theory, the terrain theory, I really urge you to read about it. Our eating, we are, as human beings, we're part of the ecosystem. We have to get ourselves better aligned with the environment, and that includes eating better.
Thank you so much, Colleen.
Thank you for, did anybody else want to tackle that question before we move on?
So I agree with Dr. Ellis. I do think it's irresponsible to tell people not to get the vaccine. I do think people need to keep informed of what is happening with it. I will tell you this, I won't be the first one to get it. I will see what they're doing with it. I will be following how the testing is going, who is being tested, what the results are.
Yes.
But we all are responsible to do that.
Okay. So the next question pretty much piggybacks on the question that I just asked, and that is, what is the potential negative impact of distrust of the medical community should a vaccine for COVID-19 be developed?
That's the conversation we're just having.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not going to be first
just to
because
say,
I don't trust them.
yeah, it's
That's
like
right.
have a
That's right.
healthy distrust. It to be a healthy distrust of the medical profession. We are Black people, we're in a white system, and they've made it very clear time and time again that they do not like us and like to sterilize us and kill us off if given the opportunity. So let us not just think that somehow we should just not remember these things when we go to these people for help.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's
Right.
a great statement that was in the Zoom chat from Kausha. She said, we need to make sure that we do not bend to the penny. It's so easy to get caught up in the money in front of you instead of the history behind you. Those of us who are able need to keep our foot on the medical industrial complex's neck so they do not repeat history again. Colleen?
Mhm.
Okay. And this question is specifically for Dr. Allen. And it is trauma and mental health is largely stigmatized within the Black community. In order to progress as a community together, how do we address generational compounded trauma and more specifically, undo historical and contemporary Stockholm syndrome?
So I talked about Stockholm syndrome in response to that question a little earlier, but I think that we are, you're seeing more Black doctors, Black psychiatrists, Black psychologists, and I think that you're finding people who are working from theories that are related to us. And so I think that the more that happens, the more exposure there is to it, the less of a stigma it will be for mental health. I think that the days, and I already think that it's happened to some degree. I think that I look at the generation of young people that are in college now, they don't have the same stigmas around mental health and trauma the way the way my generation, I was going to say older, but I'm not going to call myself older, the way my generation does. I think they're more open to knowing that it can't just happen in church. It can't just happen around the kitchen table. That sometimes there is some professional help that is needed and should be sought out. And I think the more you see people that look like you in those roles, you can begin to trust more. And I need to tell you, I used to do this presentation called Swimming in Shark-Infested Waters. And the thing about swimming in shark-infested waters when you're a fish is that all the fish that look like you are not fish. And all the fish that look like sharks are not sharks. And so I say that to say there are people of other ethnicities that work with us around trauma and around mental health issues that are very good at what they do. And so you have to be able to find the person that's going to be able to give you what you need. And I stop from saying the same race as you because we also know that race is a social construct. There is really one race, and that's the human race. You're right. We have different ethnic backgrounds, but there's one race.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
Question that was posed on Facebook from Amen Carr. Yes.
She's here.
A researcher.
Yes.
She has a question for the panelists. What advice do you have for white people and non-Black people of color who want to engage in meaningful dialogues about anti-racism and be better allies to Black people without adding to the tokenism and the emotional labor that Black people already experience on a daily basis?
Wow, loaded.
That's a great question.
Yes, it's a very good question.
It's an easy answer, actually, because a man, we can introduce a man and say what she did. I mean, a man called, she was one of the first to say, let's do this thing, let's do this article. And I have to say, I got support from her like I have never had from any librarian in my life. And imagine I'm in America, I'm not attached to any institution. And she said, okay, what resources do you need? And I didn't have to go searching for anything. I said, oh man, can you look for, yeah, no problem. She'd set up this thing. Can you imagine the
Yes.
privilege of that? The work that cut out, because she did all the chasing after the materials and then would set it all up. She'd set up the list of the journals that we had. This is what I call action. This is not just, you know, a passive kind of, yes, I sympathize, but can I walk away? She was leading it. She was constantly saying, okay, let's have the meeting. I can arrange a meeting. I can do the link. Very fast, very efficient.
I can connect you to these people.
Yeah, but at no time did she try to lead our struggle. We have to lead our own struggle. But to
her question, which I think is very
best example
important,
of that.
To her question, what advice would we give to you know, white people and non-Black people of color who want to engage in these types of meaningful dialogues?
I would just say, not only should the dialogue be meaningful, but for white people, they have to be ready for us to have these courageous conversations. Keyword is courageous. So that means I'm not going to sit there. I'm going to lead. Of course, and my people are going to lead in this, but please do not expect me to make you feel comfortable. Because it's not going to be a comfortable conversation, because racism is not comfortable. Sexism is not comfortable. It's not comfortable. Put away your emotions. Put away your feelings. Don't use yourself as a measurement to say, well, I didn't do that to you. I don't want to hear it. So let's just talk about this on a collective level instead of these individual stories that we may have to say, well, I have a Black friend, but I didn't do this to you. So therefore, kill that. I don't want to hear it. It has to be a courageous conversation. Put your feelings away and understand that your social positionality in society, you may have to exert some kind of privilege, but someone has to put that in check during a conversation. So that would be my advice.
Thank you. With that.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Do you have a question? No, sure, go ahead, Doc.
No, Marlene, you can go.
Dr. Ellis, go right ahead.
Oh, well, I just want to say, I want to say this. I know that there are some white people that are, I'm thinking of the, what's the white activist who does the blue eyes, Jane
Elliott.
I think what I want to say to all white people, you are an ally if you recognize this is also your struggle as well as mine.
Great.
Thank you.
Ms. Sigalon?
Yeah, I wanted to say I appreciate the points that everybody brought up as well. I think something that's always fascinating for me when I look at other members of our community of color is that there is so much anti-Blackness within that community as well. And I think that it's actually critical for everyone to sit down, systemically assess themselves, and to really critically reflect on some of these notions of anti-Blackness that are deep in people's hearts. Even as a community of Black persons, anti-Blackness still exists in our community, as well as there are different levels of what is a good Black and a bad Black. And it might seem like that might be something that doesn't fully make sense, but there are definitely privileges that the way an American life is revered than somebody who is living on $1 per day in a village in Nigeria. There is a difference to it. And even with regard to the vaccine, people here are afraid, but the reality is we're more likely to be tested before any of you get the vaccine. So, and this has been the case throughout history. Before something even comes here, we're the first group picked, and it's like, okay, it works, let's keep it going. But I think that's what's really critically important, as I think people kind of excuse themselves for racism because they're persons of color, and that's absolutely not true. As some of the hardest things that have also happened to persons of color is, or Black persons, it's our silence from our fellow Black and brown persons. When something happens to them, we stand up, we say something, and then when it comes to Black people, people just become completely silent. And it's not just white silence, it can be brown silence as well. So I definitely wanted to mention that as well.
Okay, so we still have time and we do have some more questions. I hate speaking in generalizations, but we all know that for the past 400 years, Black people have been traumatized, and especially in 2020. So inquiring minds want to know, what are some of the personal sources of healing and hope for each one of you? And how do you move forward through this trauma and anxiety?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Personally, for me, I do my best to stay off of social media because it's just too much on the brain. So I try to maybe like 5 minutes, but I don't even try to do that anymore. Um, I do more talking with my daughter who's 19 years old. She talks about her levels of trauma and everything that's going on, and I talk about mine, but just getting that out, but also just having spaces like this, which definitely
Yes.
helps. And this is what we need more of, especially at our individual institutions, so to speak, but we need these type of brave and safe spaces to talk about this and be courageous to talk about it.
Yes.
So that's how.
We have a comment. Dr. Tanya says that Black people must love Black people.
Good.
And I think that is so true.
Brother Rob used to say, I think the best of you and want the best for you. That's love.
Wow.
I would quote this about Audre Lorde. She said in one of her poems, "When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid."
Mm-hmm.
And so it is about becoming more confident in ourselves, more powerful, always, always more power and strength. If we're not doing anything that feeds that, then it's not worth doing, I would say.
Okay.
So so the question was, where do we draw our hope and strength from? Is that correct, Colleen?
Where you draw, yes. Mm-hmm.
So I am a Christian, and so I go to church, virtual church, Bedside Baptist right now, but still I listen to sermons, I pray with other people. And so I draw strength from that. I also read and walk and swim and things where I can get connected beyond what's tangible, but get connected to the spiritual. I find strength there, and I find hope there.
Wonderful. Anybody
Yes,
else
music
before we
is
move
healing,
on
Dr.
would
Gates.
like to?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Music is therapeutic and healing.
Yes, it is.
I was going to say it's something that I've just always termed, and I'm sure other people have used it before, but it's called soul work. So I just think that it's important that we are working in our communities and that we are working together. But at the end of the day as well, you are only as effective as you are healthy. So if you yourself are not necessarily doing well, how can you be so effectively used in this general movement? And even as we address Black and Brown mental health, one of the reasons I went into this space is to actually create a space, because just because you're a practitioner doesn't mean that you are absolved of all the different biases and stigmas that are also perpetuated in our minds about what people who have mental disorders are like. And I've seen it time after time again. It's not only white practitioners, we're still human beings and we're not beyond our socialization. So personally for myself, I think it's important that I do my own soul searching, I do my own soul work, and it's always been critical to provide spaces where I want someone to feel that they can fully exist because I'm giving them that space to be able to do that. And this whole idea of just loving one another as Black and Brown persons and creating such an opportunity and meeting people at their place of trauma. Everybody is at a completely different walk. For some people, it's very clear where they're at. And some people, like my brother, for example, who had finally clicked in his mind that racism exists because of George Floyd. And no, I mean, but people are at different levels of their experience and understanding. So
I'm glad you said that. We have a statement from Nuella Burgess, and it says that it is all out struggle, excuse me, if we want a better society and a better world. Black and white people have to work together, and my first pledge is to believe it when I'm told this or that it's racist. Even if I do not at first understand why, I must believe my Black sister or brother because they know what I do not know. I think that's very powerful.
Yeah, thank
It
you.
reminds me of a statement that Dr. King says. He says, we must learn to live together as brothers or we will perish together as fools.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, we have to learn to work through some of these these disagreements, and whether they're monumental, a lot of them are, and some of them small, but we have to start looking at each person's humanity. So that's
Right.
what, to me, when I read that, that's what it, so thank you so much for that, Nuala.
So we still have about 15 minutes left. And so I'll take a couple of more questions that I'll read. What policy solutions do you think America should adopt in order to combat anti-Blackness that occurs globally, especially in lower middle income countries?
Well, I think it's, for all the reasons that we have said, we lack organization. And so I think that we're not having enough political conversations. Because when our knowledge increases about how the politics is working, we can engage more powerful in the systems that surround us. So we have to do that before we can really influence policy. Otherwise, you know, we're going around in circles. But we make people only get elected if they support the policies that we want. But at the moment, as I can see in America and in England, we're voting for people, whether we know what their policies are or not.
Yeah. Yep.
So I think that there are a few systems that we have to change policies around. And the first one is education. We have got to do a better job of educating our children, and that's all of our children. But right now, I have a particular focus on those of African descent. We have got to make education a priority. I look at what's happening in Philadelphia public schools, for example, and it's a disgrace. It's a disgrace what is accepted as passing.
Yeah.
And we need to develop policies around what type of education beginning in preschool on up. And American history and Black history cannot be separated. It has to be a part of the whole education. So, you know, I know there's this big thing about tearing down these different monuments and stuff. I don't really care one way or the other, as long as we understand who it is and what they did.
That's right.
And we all need to know that. We need to know who Christopher Columbus really was and what he did. And we need to work on education policy. The other thing is everybody should have health care. Darren quoted Dr. King earlier, and I'm going to quote him now. He says, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and the most inhumane. We have got to change our healthcare system so that it is equitable and it is just. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is we've got to do something about our economic systems.
Yeah.
I just want to harp upon what Dr. Valerie just said, starting with education. I'm an assistant professor of education, so this is what I teach my students, and I use a social justice lens when I'm teaching them. And most of my students are, you know, predominantly white, but I teach them through a social justice mission when it comes to education. So to go back to some of the monuments that Dr. Valerie was just talking about, I've also challenged them to say, well, what if a child is unaware about Thomas Jefferson and you are someone who identifies as white? What exactly are you going to tell them? So of course,
Right.
well, he was just the third, blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, if you're going to use, which is what my research focus is, critical theory in education, how are you going to teach your students to challenge the curriculum that's mainly created through a white male privileged lens? How are you going to actually incorporate in doing that? So, okay, you're unaware about doing that. So why don't you just try to educate them in the more so that middle to high school level, where they're able to actually take on this type of information, be brutally honest with them. But why don't you ask your students and challenge them to say, well, you know, Thomas Jefferson was the one who came up with the whole 1 drop rule. 1/4 of this, you're this, 1/8 you're this. Have your students to try to say, well, wait a minute, how is it that you measure 1/4 of anything? What scale are you using? Having them challenge this very curriculum that has set all of us, again, going back to their white supremacy trauma trance. How do I know looking at somebody as 1/4 and 1/8 of anything? At the same time, you know, you're following this white lens of Thomas Jefferson, who raped a 15-year-old girl and had 5 babies with her. So I said, these things need to be said for what they are. So I agree, don't take down the monuments, talk about it in these classrooms when it starts with education, if we believe in social justice. It has to be a brutally honest, courageous conversation once again.
Bring out the truth, the real truth.
Exactly.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we can do more. You know, I have a brother called Kofi Klu from Ghana, and he was educated through the Kwame Nkrumah era, and that curriculum was a huge radical curriculum. They were taught all the political movements of the Caribbean. They were taught all the kind of radical historical developments across Britain, the Caribbean, Africa. He knew them better than I did. And it was about helping to see the whole global picture of the African struggle. So I think it's got to be way beyond the national discourse. I think it's almost, of course, if we tell the story through the struggle of revolution, we learn about what white people did. But a lot of the time, you know, Thomas Jefferson is important, but not that important, actually very minor compared to the bigger stories of Patrice Lumumba, perhaps, and Biko, and, you know, there are many revolutionaries that we do not know about. And then to put them in the positions of their political thinking, I think there's a lot more advancement. We can go much further. And that would be an education, a real education for white people, as well as for ourselves.
Yeah. Real fast, I just want to interject. I think we need to have a community, a good dialogue and open conversations between the generations. I think that's one of the things that we miss out on a lot, is that, you know, you have generation, the baby boomers, to generation X, to the millennials, and to the generation Z. And there's so many different things that are being said that sometimes we don't then pause and listen to what they're saying, because we all have the right answer and idea. And I think that we need to kind of step back and start really engaging in good, communication, so we can start listening to each other's concerns.
And I think that everybody addressed, thank you, Darren. I think everybody addressed Carol Mack's question, but I'll read it anyway, because it talked about education. She said that the British initiated slavery and instilled these voids between the different ethnicities. Don't we need to start with education in schools? And I think you kind of addressed that. Maybe that's not where we start, but it definitely needs to be there. Did anybody else want to say something to that question?
Well, she's my sister, so I'm going to say yes, I agree.
So I think that it needs to start even before school.
It starts at home.
I think that, right. We need to start it at home and in our communities. We often talk about it, and I'm not saying that we need to go back to everything, but I grew up on a block, and matter of fact, my block right now is a block where everybody knows everybody, and everybody is responsible for everybody. And there are values that are learned, that are taught, that you begin before you even get to school. There is history that is learned, and I think we have to start it before they get to school.
Yeah, I just want to say something about the monument, to say that I think they should all come down because of the psychological impact. I think it was happening in the South with seeing these Confederates, and they'd actually grown after the Civil War. They'd grown during the Jim Crow era. So there was something psychologically deliberate and damaging about that. And the same in England. We've got all these big white men heroes all over the place. So I do think it's very healthy, Cecil Rhodes, to bring down. It's the psychological damage seeing these people left up there as heroes.
Wow. I have a statement from Facebook from Pam. Family is the primary institution and parents the first teacher. how can we unite our individual house to a home, then connecting the home to grow a supportive village?
I would say to that, that I always felt as though that a house that does not have books for children to read and others to read, then you're pretty much making like an incubation of a prison.
Mm,
Your house should be toppled with books from the top down to the bottom, and even allowing, I know we have this thing about young people on their cell phones, but at least they're reading something. I have to say that they're not always looking at videos. So there was this article I read years ago called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" by Nicholas
mm,
Clark. And one of the things he actually said in the argument was that the baby boomers, not Gen X, but millennials and Gen Z were doing way more reading than what Gen X and baby boomers were doing. So of course people were like, no, that's not true. We have books, they have phones. So he argued, well, that's the point. They're reading things on their phone. You never said how it should be done or where it should be done or what they should have in their hand. You just said read. So if it's a stop sign on the corner, if it's the street post, if it's something on a billboard, they're reading. So that's something we can't complain about. But if the house does not have something to read, pretty much you're just building a prison right there.
mm.
That's what you're doing.
That's
I
deep.
love the book
So-
idea. I think that's great.
Yeah.
Dr. Howard Stevenson, I heard him do a presentation a couple of years ago, and it kind of relates to this question. And he says, everybody knows the saying, it takes a village to raise a child, but what does it take to raise a village? And so that's, part of what, this question is asking is how do we become a village? And that kind of goes back to what I was saying about, your child and your life can't just be what happens within the four walls of your home. You've got to be connected to other like-minded people, to other people who will expose your child to books or other things to read, to people who have the same values as you. My friends and I don't know what Pam raised that comment, but I have a friend, Pam, and we used to always tell our children, if you ever need to talk to an adult and you don't want to talk to me, you could talk to her because I know what her values are. She's in our village.
Yeah.
So, or it wasn't just that one person, but the idea is that you have to grow your village with people who are like-minded, who have values. And the more you grow your village, then you have villages that can connect, and that will only make us stronger.
I want to say that, I hesitate to say that I'm old, but I really am. And
No, you.
I have a whole, work history behind me. But the truth is, I have been the most empowered and the most engaged when I have been doing political action with my community.
Mm.
That is where I've had the most personal growth and the most strongest development, when I've been held to account, when I've had to read. The people that, I most admire are the people that are working community. And, and I can think of them straight off my head in England, Sister Esther Stanford Kotsay, Kofi Klu, Explo. These people have devoted their lives in activism, in service to the community. And that is where my biggest growth has been. And that is why I say to others, it doesn't matter whether you're working or not, whether you're studying or not, you should always, always be in service to your community doing something.
Thank you. We have about a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to read this comment from Caroline Wong. And she said, I want to thank you for addressing the issue of discrimination and lack of allyship among other groups of color. That is one of the things that we have to address in order to build coalitions that can support all of us. We can't continue to fight each other and hope to achieve a more equal society. Thought that was real relevant.
Yes.
Yeah.
Did anybody have any last words before we close out?
I just wanted to say this. It just goes back to our collective responsibility with healthcare, with policies, but also our individual responsibility as a people when it comes to healthcare. So I just wrote this down. But if we can ask many questions about our phones, we can ask a lot of questions about the cars that we buy and things of that nature, then we need to be asking our questions to our healthcare providers that exceed the number of questions that we ask when it comes to our phones and the kind of cars that we buy.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I just want to say thank you to the people I've worked with, because look, everybody I've worked with on this webinar and doing this article, everybody's done it in their spare time. They've all been doing other things. That this is, you know, this pandemic, we could have put our feet up and just, you know, rode with it, but everybody went through sweat and tears trying to just get this done, just because of commitment, just because of conviction. And in the end, you have to be your integrity. You are your own advocate for your integrity and commitment. And the speakers here are a really good reflection of that.
Thank you.
Darren, there was a slide that we didn't see.
That you had?
Yes.
Okay. I did see it. Let me see if I can still find it. Oh, implications. I think that was the slide.
Nope.
No?
We talked about implications. I think it was after that.
After that was a Q&A.
Maybe it's after that.
Then we had Aman.
Yes.
Oh, let me get that up. That's right. Give me 1 second.
Yes. So we did want to really give, and we said it earlier, but I just want to again give a thank you to Aman, who was a librarian extraordinaire, and she was just so helpful to us along the way, and we wanted to make sure that we acknowledged her appropriately. And so like Marlene said, we were all doing this in our spare time. So there were other things that she could have been doing, but she made it a priority to get stuff together for us. And we could not have done what we did without her assistance. So we just want to say thank you.
Thank you so much. And there was something else on this slide.
Oh, yes. So on the 30th, and so we'll continue this conversation as
Allen,
yes.
I was going to talk about that in closing.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, that's okay. So I just want to close us out, and I have to say that I had to read this article before today, and Alucia said that we need to take steps away from us being in a state of ignorance. And one way of moving past our current situation is to understand the situation that we find ourselves in today. And you know, it's so crazy that racism, it assigns value to the color of our skin and how we look. And we know that racism hurts the health of our nation by preventing some people the opportunity to attain their highest level of health. And I know this has been a great discussion. It cannot end here today. Right. Especially discussion that will focus on how to eliminate these health disparities. So I have to start with thanking each one of the panelists for their eloquent, information-packed, and thought-provoking presentations. Specifically, I would like to thank Dr. Zakia Gates, Dr. Marlene Ellis, Dr. Valerie Allen, and Ms. Alucia Sagoon. Thank you for sharing this wealth of information tonight. I know a lot of research had to go into making this possible. So again, I know people have already thanked her, but I need to thank her again, Ms. Aman, and she did a lot of the research. Of course, I have to thank all of you who attended the program tonight. It is my hope that this article and these types of discussions will spark further dialogue, discussion, and investigation, and possibly even some policy and cultural reform that we need if we plan on moving forward and changing these disparities. Let me also thank the institutions that these panelists represent: the Prini University, Columbia University, the University of Pennsylvania Libraries, and the African American Resource Center at the University of Pennsylvania. If you want more information about each of these panelists, there's a slide that contains their contact information. And I think we also put their phone numbers. We have them somewhere. I think it's also have been written down.
And once the article is published, we will be sending it out.
Right.
Once the article is published.
Right. And so Dr. Allen was getting ready to talk about it. So, you know, one of the things that the African American Resource does is that we co-sponsor and sponsor.
Wait, can Darren put the slide back up?
Okay.
Sure. Which one, Dr. Allen?
The last slide.
Sure. The last slide is this one right here. Okay. And oops, I'm sorry. Let me go ahead and share it, which I forgot to do. Where we at? Share. Last slide was, which was it? Thank you. Oh,
When the marches end.
when the march.
Yeah,
Okay.
when the march is in.
All right. I just have to go back one. Ooh. It was up. There it is. Okay.
Okay. Thank you for that. So when the march is in, are we for real this time? That's a big question. And this program is being sponsored by the African American Resource Center and Anetta Center for Community Partnerships. And it's going to take a further look at all the responses to the civil unrest and protesting of racism and social injustice, including the murder of George Floyd. It's going to probe a lot of real questions that we need to ask ourselves if we plan on moving forward. The panelists will include Dr. Richard Gordon, Dr. Leslie Jones, Dr. Howard Stevenson, and the moderator is Dr. Herman Beavers. And I hope to see all of you to come out again for this Zoom program. If we do not have an email for you and you're not on our listserv, just leave your information in our chat and we'll add you to the listserv. Remember that we are the African American Resource, and if you feel you need some of our services or somebody to talk to, you could call us at 215-898-0104 or email us at aarc.upenn.edu. And I just want to end with saying that if Black lives truly matters, then Black health is paramount. And I want to thank you for coming out tonight, and we hope to see you again in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Darren and Colleen, for your moderation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great.
Okay. I'm ending it.
Oh, you're ending it. I thought you were waiting for everyone to leave.
Oh, okay. Wait. Okay.
We can tune the music up.
Yeah.
You said cue the
Cue the
music up?
music.
Oh yeah.
We still have people.